listener production.
Hey, Chris Speary with you. Welcome to The Briefing. The illegal tobacco industry is booming, and despite its links to violent crime, firebombings, and dodgy under-the-counter sales, more and more people are turning to it in search of cheaper alternatives. Experts say we need to change our tact, with the government's hefty excise just fueling the problem and current policing not working.
We've really been touching them with the kid gloves at the moment, and we need to take those off and get really serious about these criminals.
That chat with a former police officer who led one of the teams cracking down on illegal tobacco in Australia is coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Tara Cassidy. It's Tuesday, the 1st of April.
Good morning, Chris. Good morning, everyone, and happy Tuesday and happy April Fool's Day. Now, unfortunately, this first story is not a joke. I wish it was for the hopeful home buyers out there, but it'll be good news for home owners. Our house prices and rents are at record highs again. That comes as hopeful purchasers will be keeping a close eye on the RBA's rate decision this afternoon, with economists predicting we won't be getting back-to-back cuts after being given some slight interest rate reprieve in Feb, currently sitting at 4.1%. The bump in house prices follows a short-lived dip earlier in the year, believed to be thanks to last month's rate cut, with the latest CoreLogic data showing house prices in every city rose, except Hobart, poor Tassie, with the national median value now at $820,000, and of all capital cities, Adelaide went up the most. And devastatingly for us, Chris, our cities had the highest median prices. Sydney, the median house price is now $1.19 million, Brizzy $899,000, followed closely by Canberra, Adelaide and Perth, all in the 800Ks, and then Melbourne, which was surprising to me, at $781,000 median house price, which is just wild.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that Sydney still wants to stay in this $1 million club is personally offensive to me. I just wish we'd do better as a city. Now, look, economists say that even if we were to get an RBA cut for May, this rise in the property market would offset that win for a lot of people, with houses still unaffordable for so many Australians across the country. But we will know at 2:30 today or 1:30 Australian Eastern Standard Time. Set your clocks. And while we are talking ouchies on the hip pocket, the government's approved annual premium health insurance increase will take effect today as well. So anyone...
Just what we need.
Anyone who has private health insurance, which is around 50% of Australians, do expect that your insurance is going to go up by 3.73%. That was the approved average rate, but there is also room for that to go higher and lower depending on what policy you hold.
Yeah, and that'll be averaged across policies. So people on higher levels of cover could see even bigger hikes. For example, HCF members, which unfortunately I am one, but luckily not on this highest level of cover. But they've increased its gold top tier policy by 35%, which is outrageous. The health minister's come out saying it's a legal loophole called product phoenixing, and the Department of Health will be investigating it, saying it is exploiting Aussies. Just un-Australian, I say, in a cost of living crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is worth noting, if you do have private health insurance, shop around. This is now the time to shop around. This is now the time to snag a bargain, and also negotiate with your health fund, which now I'm giving financial advice, but I actually negotiated. I was paying every 12 months. I switched to an 18-month plan, and I managed to save myself $7 a month. So, hey, that's not as much as what was promised in the budget for us, but $7 a month I will take, I guess. We're curious to know how much your private health insurance has gone up. If it has gone up, if it's gone down, let us know. Reach out to us if you're listening on Spotify. Drop us a comment. If you're listening on Apple, drop us a review, or just reach out to us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We always love hearing from you.
The Australian Border Force says it's actively monitoring a Chinese warship that's passed the south coast of Australia. It's understood the vessel, which was fresh from conducting joint surveys and research with New Zealand, is continuing to circumnavigate Australia today, heading further west in its return to China. Here's the PM speaking about it yesterday at a press conference from Perth in key battleground state WA.
I would prefer that it wasn't there, but we live in circumstances where just as Australia has vessels in the South China Sea, this vessel is there. What our task is to do is to make sure that we represent Australia's national interests. We do that each and every day, and I have every confidence in our Defence Force and our security agencies to do just that.
Now, security experts fear the ship is conducting surveys of our sea cables and underwater capabilities, but it's important to note that the ship is outside our territorial waters and there is absolutely nothing we can do to stop it or move it along, Chris.
Yeah, it's not exactly the issue Albo wants to be dealing with again with the election looming. As for Peter Dutton, he spent yesterday checking out a mining facility in Newcastle, pit-stopped in flood-affected rural Queensland before heading to Brizzy, where he took part in Sky News' version of Q&A, which is called Paul Murray's Pub Test. It's a live TV event with Sky News host Paul Murray, answering questions directly from the audience. The opposition leader said he will tackle the woke agenda in schools and universities, while also promising to crack down on knife crime.
There's no excuse for a 12 or 13-year-old to be carrying a long-bladed weapon or a machete at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Restore the construction watchdog to tackle dodgy unions like the CFMEU, which he vowed to abolish in his budget reply last week. Bring migration down to a level that serves Australia's best interests and restore national pride.
We can prioritise restoring pride in our country again, and I think the teachers who have been part of the protests on university campuses or on the streets of Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane, the indoctrination that's taken place in some parts of our education system or on university campuses, I don't think has been conducive to what's in our country's best interests. And we should restore pride. We should be proud of who we are.
Interesting there that there's a bit of a conflation and almost attack on our education system and connecting that to national pride. Anyway, as to the Prime Minister, he is off to Adelaide today, so he's charting a course opposite to the warship, really. And he's continuing his health promises, announcing $150 million in funding for a new health centre in the city's south. And it is important to note that where he's making that announcement, that is a seat currently held by the opposition.
Hey, a heads up, this next story talks about allegations of child sexual abuse. Convicted killer Chris Dawson, who many will know from the true crime podcast Teacher's Pet, has appeared via video in court to try and appeal his carnal knowledge conviction. It relates to an underage relationship he was found guilty of having with a teenage girl in the 1980s. He was sentenced to 3 years jail following a 2-week trial, but now is trying to overturn that conviction. For those that don't know, carnal knowledge nowadays would be called child sexual abuse, but for historical offences, people are charged against the legislation of that time, so that's why it's listed as that.
Dawson's defence team are arguing that the teen was 17 when the pair's first sexual encounter took place, while the prosecution's arguing she hadn't gotten her learner's permit and was only 16. Dawson's already serving a 24-year jail sentence for the murder of his wife, Lynette Sims, which he's also attempting to appeal in the High Court. And a reminder, if this story's raised any issues for you, you can call 1-800-RESPECT or Lifeline on 13 11 14.
Now, if you've been following the news at all, you might have gotten the impression that our bosses are slowly but surely calling time on working from home. Big businesses like Amazon, Woolies and Coles, as well as a bunch of local councils and, of course, the Coalition, have all made headlines for wanting to get employees back in the office as much as possible, Chris.
But new research, Tara, is suggesting they might be missing the mark completely, with the number of Aussie organisations forcing employees to work from the office 3 to 5 days a week, dropping from 48% to 44% since 2023. That's according to a national survey of around 1,000 HR professionals by the Australian HR Institute, who also found the number of employees required to make zero office attendance has climbed in percentage terms from 25% to 28%. So that's the amount of people that their bosses are like, hey, you don't have to come in, you can work entirely from home.
Yeah, and the AHRI's chief executive says that their research shows no evidence of a shift back to the physical workplace and that many Aussie bosses see hybrid work as a legitimate way to boost performance, which I applaud, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we're in positions that we can't work from home all the time. But interestingly, from this survey, the key takeaway was that employees loved the reduced amount of stress and money that they have to spend commuting to work. That was a big factor here, was saving on the commute times. And look, as we've spoken about time and time again on this show, this is something that parents are absolutely welcoming and loving. We know that it's trickled into politics. We know it forms part of the coalition's plan in some capacity. How that's going to work and whether it'll impact more than just the public service is something that remains to be seen.
Yeah, absolutely. And also just think about, it's extra time back in your day. So people get to spend more time with their family members, less time in a car. I think this will be good news for many people who love having a few hours extra back in their week.
And if you know exactly why I am playing this track to kick off our last headline of the day. From almost being the leader of the free world to taking centre stage at a property conference on the Gold Coast, Kamala Harris, she's coming down under for her first ever Australian speaking engagement. The former Vice President of the United States will be one of 32 speakers at a property industry conference in May this year, alongside Aussie Olympians Emma McKeon and Ariane Titmus. The 2-day conference will be held from May 25 to May 26. Tara, you live in Brizzy. You are far closer to the Gold Coast than I am. Will you be making the trip to go visit Kamala Harris?
I mean, great speakers, but such an interesting engagement. To almost be president, like you said, of the free world and then be going into a real estate conference, I don't know. But would love to hear from the Olympians as well. What about you, Chris? Going to make the flight from Sydney?
Look, no. No objections to Kamala Harris. I'm excited to see what she'll do. I'm sure she'll make more than just this conference a thing. I'm sure she'll be doing some other stuff. So very curious to see what she does. And interestingly, how the public react. That's what I'm most looking forward to seeing.
Yeah, and just a quick one after that, Chris, that relates to today's deep dive. There'll also be some changes coming into effect today in the tobacco industry. We've heard that health warnings will now be listed on individual cigarettes as opposed to just on the packet, while menthols are going to be phased out entirely. As to whether that'll make any difference to the amount of people smoking, well, I spoke to an expert who reckons it's a little bit too little too late and that this is the government's own mess. You'll hear that in my deep dive up next. The Australian government is losing its war on illegal tobacco, and we're paying the price.
The cost of the escalating tobacco wars.
Piles of illegal cigarettes.
Detectives have linked an arson attack on a home that killed a 27-year-old woman to the illegal tobacco trade.
As the illegal market flourishes around the country.
Violent crimes linked to the black market are rising, and so is the number of people turning to it for smokes and vapes at a third of the price. Last week, we learnt that's burnt a near $7 billion hole in the federal budget, with the government now throwing $150 million of our taxpayer dollars to help police crack down on the issue. Joining me now is Rohan Pike, a former federal police officer who helped form the Australian Border Force's illicit tobacco strike team. Rohan, welcome to the briefing. We've got a number of various federal, border, state and territory-led illicit tobacco task forces, one of which you helped start, all working towards stamping out the illegal trade. Is it all necessary and is it working?
Necessary, certainly, yes. We need some enforcement in order to encourage people, change people's behaviour away from the illicit market and back to the legal market. So that's the core premise of all these task forces, and to obviously stamp out any violence that might be associated with the organised crime gangs that are running the trade at the moment.
Why do you think, with so much focus on this area and so much effort and funding, why do we still have such a big issue?
Well, the issue is just enormous. It's really been underestimated for at least 10 years now, since I've been banging on about it. When I was back in the ABF back in 2015-16, I tried to alert authorities then. They didn't ramp up the enforcement response. Now they are, and it's possibly too little too late. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that they're trying to suppress. It's just a huge problem to overcome, and the millions that they're spending now in enforcement may have some minor effect in stopping it, but the organised crimes groups are so entrenched that it's very difficult now to stop it.
We've seen a lot of violence, gang crimes, arson attacks relating to the illegal tobacco industry. What is behind that and what's the goal?
Yeah, well, in Victoria, we've had a dominant crime group that's run the illicit trade for a couple of decades. But more recently, other crime gangs have decided to get in on the giggle, being attracted by the massive profits that are able to be made. So new crime gangs are wanting to muscle in on the territory that the previous group had. In order to do that, they've used threats of fires and actual fires, other extortion tactics, but they're trying to get access to the shops where they can get their product to their consumers. And that's where the profits are actually made. So that's the Victorian, South Australian, Western Australian sort of story. In Sydney, there has been, as I said before, a dominant crime group running the show up there, and they seem to still be the dominant force. So there's no one really threatening them at the moment, and that's perhaps why there hasn't been the fires in Sydney at this stage. But obviously, again, those arrests that took place this week showed that they were stealing illicit product off rivals up there, and that suggests that perhaps violence is coming in the way of Sydney as well.
What do you think is needed to properly combat the issue? Like, is the tougher laws going to be the right answer, or do we need a completely different approach? It's
a combination of things. It's the tax policy itself that is failing. It's failing on the revenue side, it's failing on the enforcement side. Some people would argue it's failing on the harm reduction side. So it's the tax policy itself that needs to be addressed, and this government has said that they're not going to do that. However, our tobacco policy is really based on that false assumption that we can stop everyone smoking. So if we just keep raising tax rates high enough, then everyone will stop smoking. But that's not the case. It's unrealistic. Now we've got this problem we're dealing with where there's just as many smokers almost as there was 5 years ago, but they're not actually paying any revenue to the government. So that needs to be understood before we change the tax policy. One of the major drivers, obviously, of the illicit trade is the price, the excise rate that we've put on cigarettes, which is $1.40 per stick. That needs to be reviewed. So whether that means a freezing of that rate while we address the enforcement side of things, or whether that actually means a return to a more reasonable level. Either way, it's unbalanced at the moment, and all the excise rate is doing is encouraging people to move away from the legal product and to the illegal product. So that balance is currently skewed. We've gone past that point of the sweet spot, I guess you'd call it, where we do get some revenue. We do discourage people from smoking, so we don't want to make it easy. However, because there's a rampant illicit trade, which is so cheap, that's actually easily accessible for smokers to get cigarettes at prices that they haven't seen for perhaps 20 years. So that's what we've created at the moment, and we have to obviously stop that. But yeah, when you've got a choice between $10 to $15 and say $45, it's a no-brainer that people will go for the cheaper product now. Up until 5 years ago, the government was receiving about $16.5 billion. So that figure's now down to $7.5. So that's a 60% drop off in 5 years. Last year it was 9.5, the year before 12.5. So it's really fallen off a cliff, that revenue. And those people, the vast majority of them are moving over to the illicit market. So that's growing at an exponential rate. It's not impossible to imagine that the legal market will almost be extinct in a couple of years. So it's going so quickly. That's money that can't be spent by the government on other health issues or other projects for the government. So if that doesn't alert people that what a problem we've got, just the rate of the expansion of the market, then I'm not sure what will. But it's certainly taken the eye of some people in Treasury, and it should do in the Health Department as well.
There's stats online from the Federal Illicit Tobacco Task Force between 2018 and 2025 that says that the amount of tobacco seized and destroyed is in the millions, which sounds really strong, but then the number of convictions appears quite low in comparison, sitting at around 60. Do you think we're getting bang for our buck?
It's a classic law enforcement response to seize product and publicise those seizures as if that's a win and that they're doing their job as instructed. But really, that doesn't have any effect, I wouldn't think, on these crime groups. They would just import more product to cover what's been lost, and they would write that off as a business expense. The convictions and fines of individuals is a far more harsh deterrent. And certainly I don't think that the deterrent is enough. People are still being attracted to the crime type. It's still considered very low risk, especially when compared to other illicit drugs. If you're caught with sizable quantities of those, you're very likely to go to jail for quite a long time, whereas that's unlikely with tobacco. So that's only encouraging people. So we haven't quite got the deterrence right. We need to obviously dissuade people from wanting to enter into this crime type.
And so if you could offer up a solution, say, tomorrow, would that be your focus? Harshening our laws and sentencing?
It'd be one of them. It's not an easy fix. So it's going to take more than just one fix for this to turn it around. Certainly we need to look at the drivers. The driver's clearly the price of these things, and then we have to turn around behaviours through deterring people from entering the crime, and that does mean harsher penalties, rigorous enforcement in a more sustained way. So we've really been touching them with the kid gloves at the moment, and we need to take those off and get really serious about these criminals.
Does the everyday Aussie who's consuming these products have some part to play themselves? Like these people that are going and buying their favourite flavoured vape or cigarette from these places for personal use because they can't fathom paying $50. Would you have any advice to them?
I don't blame them for choosing the cheaper option, but they do need to understand that they're supporting organised crime. And when they do that, each packet's really a fraud on the government for $30 every time they do it. But these organised crime groups are getting stronger, they're creating more violence, and it's only going to end pretty badly for the community as a whole as these crime groups get bigger and stronger. So those consumers are contributing to that. But on the other hand, again, I don't blame them for going for the cheap product. It's something that the government's caused, and the government really needs to change that policy.
Rohan, thank you very much for today, and thank you so much for joining me on The Briefing.
Thanks, Tara.
That was former Federal Police Officer Rohan Pike speaking with me there about how we should be tackling the illegal tobacco industry. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. If you know someone who you think might find this ep interesting, we'd love it if you could share it with them or our social posts. You can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube, search Listener Newsroom. I'm Tara Cassidy. See you next time.
Listener.